and welcome to Recap, Per Capita's research and policy podcast where we examine inequality and unpack our latest work in our fight for a fairer Australia. We're coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay our respects to their elders past and present. We are on land that was never ceded. I'm your host, Emma Dawson, Director of Per Capita, and my co-host this week for our premiere episode is the Director of the Centre for Equitable Housing at Per Capita, Matt Lloyd-Cape.
Hi Emma, how are you?
Well, Matt, how are you?
I'm all right, yeah, I'm good.
It's been a busy time.
It's been a time, yeah. Feeling a little bit like I've been hit by a truck, but yeah, it's been a good few months of work, hasn't it?
It has indeed. So seeing as this is our premiere episode, why don't we give you a little bit of background on what we do? Matt, why don't you share with us for a start how you came to work at Per Capita?
Yeah, great. So I came to Per Capita 3 years ago, and prior to that I was working at the Australian Council of Trade Unions as an international officer and a research officer. Over my career I've worked in academia and with international aid NGOs and with the trade union movement. So that's been my kind of lens on the world, has always been through one of, I guess, class struggle and inequality, and that's how I sort of meshed in, I think, with the work at Per Capita.
You did indeed, and I remember the day when I read your application. We had a lot of interest in the position I originally hired you for, but you were a standout back then and the obvious choice to head up the new Centre for Equitable Housing here that we are launching this week. Yeah. So what's the centre all about, Matt? Tell us a bit about it, what we'll be doing, what we've released so far, and what the work in researching current housing crisis across Australia is revealing to us.
Yeah, great. Well, we originally set up the centre after we did some work on housing a few years ago. We were looking at the cost of housing and the cost of living, and we were trying to figure out different ways of understanding housing affordability and how it affects people's ability to have a decent life in Australia. And that led to some conversations with a philanthropic organisation called the VNF Housing Enterprise Foundation, who are a philanthropic organisation concerned with the current state of housing in Australia, and we're looking for new ways to really explore some solutions. So the Centre for Equitable Housing was kind of the brainchild of the VNF Foundation and yourself and me to a lesser extent, and so that's really been a great opportunity for me, because I think there's no other policy area other than housing that I can see that really impacts the potential for somebody's individual outcomes in life, but also societal outcomes and economic outcomes as well.
Yeah, I think the reason we were so interested and found this meeting of the minds with VNF was, our core purpose is addressing inequality and fighting for a fairer Australia, and the lack of access to secure, affordable, appropriate housing is now a real problem for far too many in our community. We are seeing in Australia a re-emergence of a two-class society, where unless you come from a family that owns property, you'll never form a family that owns property.
Yeah, that's right. The intergenerational wealth issues are really coming to the fore, and I think people are really seeing that in their sort of day-to-day life. Like, you might have gotten lucky and hit the jackpot and bought cheap in the 80s, bought a nice house in the 80s and seen that increase by, maybe even, a few 100% in value. But now your children might be sitting there on an insecure job, insecure employment, and be unable to get into the housing market without significant help from yourself. So even the winners in society, I think, are starting to see where the problems are. And, we haven't even discussed things like Indigenous housing. A fact that I always like to make is that only 30% of Indigenous Australians own their own home, and that's less than half of the average ownership rate. And so the majority of Indigenous Australians are renters in a land where their ancestors have been living for 60,000 years and acting as custodians and guardians of the land.
So they're renting the land we stole from them.
Mainly from white people. So there is a lot of different layers of inequality in the housing sector, and housing policy. We know that housing policy in the past has mitigated inequality in society. You can assess poverty in lots of ways, but you have before housing poverty and after housing poverty. And in the past, because we had decent levels of social housing and we had mechanisms in place to mitigate the cost of housing for low-income households, we used to have after housing poverty rates that were lower than before housing poverty rates. Now that situation shifted, and housing is one of the major contributors to poverty and also to homelessness.
But not only that, I think one of the reasons that we see the work of this centre as so important is that secure housing is really the basis for everything else. You can't get ahead in life if you don't have a secure roof over your head. And this was an issue that both sides of politics recognised in the past. And we've talked about this, we're repeating conversations we've had many times in the office here, but that in the post-war era, both the Labor and newly formed Liberal parties were very, very committed to housing affordability. They took slightly different approaches. Labor was much more about building direct social housing. The Menzies government really put home ownership at the centre of its social policies. But what we had was a recognition that having a home was the fundamental prerequisite to building a good life.
Yeah.
And we've seemed to have lost that in the era of housing financialisation.
That's right, and it's amazing when you go back to some of Menzies' speeches or Menzies era speeches, where the Liberals would be crowing about how their construction rates were so much higher than Labour's, and there was almost a competition to be the party of home construction. And for Labour, it was more about public housing to provide social renting opportunities. For Menzies, he had a phrase which is they wanted to create little capitalists by getting people into the housing market through subsidised housing construction that the state managed. And and the state built 15-16% of houses between 1945 and 1990, say, which is an extraordinary rate of construction. And these days, people don't really recognise that there even is a role, particularly for public housing construction in a lot of policy circles. And public housing construction rates are down to about 1.5% of current construction.
And we're seeing that really play out now with the housing crisis across the country. Interestingly, and we'll get on to the actual work of the centre in a moment, but it's all important background stuff. You mentioned Menzies and wanting to create a nation of little capitalists. And I think it's interesting that in the fallout from the Aston by-election, we're finally seeing some in the coalition government, in the Conservative side of politics, say, oh, hang on, young people aren't voting for us. Why is that? Well, maybe it's because they've got nothing to conserve, so they're not conservative. And therefore, they're actually starting to think maybe driving this massive financialisation of housing and this unequal market is bad for us electorally. So that might be why they might start thinking about it again, returning to Menzies' theory that if people don't own anything, they're not going to be conservatives, they're certainly not going to be capitalists.
Yeah. If you haven't got a stake in the current arrangement, why would you want to protect it?
Yeah. And that's not what we're about. We don't want to create more little capitalists, but we do want to create a fairer Australia. And any way anyone wants to come at this issue, I will welcome them for joining the cause. But let's talk a bit about how we kicked off the Centre for Equitable Housing. And I'll just start by saying it's a new centre within Per Capita. Matt's the Executive Director, and we also have Lucy Tonkin, who's the Andrew Harrington Fellow, working in that centre, and the rest of us at Per Capita sticking our noses in where we can as well. You'll never keep me away from housing research completely. But the first piece of work we decided to do, with the very generous support of VNF, is the Australian Housing Monitor. Can you tell us a bit about the Monitor and why we decided to start with a survey of community attitudes towards housing affordability and security?
Yeah, absolutely. I think two of the prongs of our kind of attack on this issue are, firstly, that we know that current trends are going to lead only downhill and towards the sort of slow erosion of that Australian dream of home ownership. But also that the media debates around housing affordability tend to just follow, not always, but often follow tropes, which might be boomers versus millennials, or renters versus landlords. And these kind of tropes, they're easy to slip into, and there's probably grains of truth in all of it. But ultimately, we didn't think that was reflecting the richness of experience of the population in general. And so we wanted to really take a step back and start with a very large survey of experiences and attitudes of Australians in the housing space. So we worked with Essential Media on a large survey design. So we had just under 4,750 respondents, Each respondent spent about 15 to 20 minutes filling out a survey, which gave us something like 750,000 data points. So it's a really rich, large-scale survey, and we asked questions on housing affordability, on opinions around current policies in the housing market, on what people think would be best policy for resolving the housing crisis at the moment. So we've got a really broad set of experiences and loads of demographic breakdown as well. So if we want to find out about rural women over 50 who vote Labour, we can do that. If we want to find out about swing voters in the urban environment, we can do that. So it gives us a really nice basis to have a look at where the actual attitudes and experiences and conversations from the public are, and that will allow us to build policy ideas from. And also it gives an idea of where the appetite for change is in society, because I think we've discussed before, but on a lot of issues where we've seen major change in Australian society, whether it's marriage equality or voice, all of these areas, they're often led by community support prior to political engagement. And we think it's the same in this instance.
It's, in my view, as you know, definitely the same. I mean, Per Capita's theory of change is that we talk to the Australian people. It's not about closed-door meetings in Canberra or Spring Street or Surrey Street. It's about public narrative. And often, funnily enough, in a democratic system, when the politicians think there are votes in something, they'll tend to do it. One of my concerns, and I know yours and those of Hugh and Ondine at VNF for many years, has been that the housing conversation's been dominated by vested interests. It's been dominated by developers or by investors. At the other end of the scale, there's been a lot of advocacy from people in the social housing sector. But what we wanted to do with this survey was drill down some of those through some of those beliefs that, people don't want their house prices to fall, for example, and see what people actually think, what they're really concerned about, and how widespread is this concern about housing affordability and accessibility. And it's massive, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's kind of existential in some ways. So people really think that the possibility for new generations to buy a house is declining rapidly, and we can talk to some numbers. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the key findings when the report was released was 85% of people who don't currently own a home still want to, but only 1 in 4 of them now believe they will.
Exactly.
And that's a pretty pessimistic view for a whole generation of people.
Yeah, and the ways of getting there are narrowing as well. So it's not only about price and your ability to get a mortgage, but the Bank of Mum and Dad is playing such a huge role as well. So we found that around 45% of our sample had received assistance from the Bank of Mum and Dad in recent years, but number of people that think that they will rely on some sort of parental support is over 70%. So we're really seeing that people don't see a pathway to ownership without some existing capital from in their family.
Well, that's sad, isn't it, that you need to wait for your parents to die before you can own a home. I mean, it shouldn't be a trade-off we have to make, should it? You can have grandparents for your kids, or you can have a house for them to live in. No.
Yeah, exactly. Or ask your parents to downsize, or it's
or dip into their super.
And it's really uncomfortable to sort of suggest that is the route that we're creating for our next generation of homeowners.
And it's not only uncomfortable, it goes against, I think, certainly everything Australians believe about themselves as an egalitarian nation, that we're a classless society. Well, there's nothing more class-based than needing an inheritance to have a roof over your head.
That's right. I mean, as you can tell, listeners, I'm from the UK, and we still have hereditary lords, we still have landowners that own vast swathes of Mayfair and so on. And, you see what that results in. It's a kind of, we still haven't shaken off the shackles of class overlordship in the UK, and you don't want to start replicating that here.
And in many ways, we're getting worse, right? We're actually at a position now where we have lower rates of outright home ownership than the UK, which was unthinkable a generation ago.
That's right. I mean, we're in the decline. We've gone from over 70% of the population owning a home, and we're down into around 65%.
Yeah.
So clearly the current model we have is not working towards that dream that anyone can wash up on the shores of Australia, get a job, blue collar, white collar, it doesn't matter, and then work towards building themselves a life where they get to have a little slice of Australia at the end of the day.
Yeah. But the monitor's not just about home ownership, is it? We've taken a real deep dive into issues for renters, because going back to that original figure, 85% of non-homeowners still want to buy a home. That means 15% don't necessarily want to buy a home, but they're not having a good time in the rental market either, are they?
Yeah, so we did drill down into a lot of different areas of the rental experience and rental affordability. So just as a broad sort of issue, around 22.5% of the renters said that they're constantly struggling to pay their rent, and 4% said they're falling behind. So it's quite a significant proportion of the population that are reporting being in some sort of rental stress.
Yeah.
If you break that down by income, it obviously rises much higher. So for low-income families, we're seeing sort of maybe 30% in rental stress, maybe more. And then, so the rental side of in terms of rental stress, I guess we're not breaking new ground on that necessarily, but where we are is we're looking at things like quality of rental stock.
Yeah.
So fewer than 50% of the population have adequate heating and cooling in their rental property.
And as the effects of climate change bite, that's going to become increasingly important.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
And that goes back to the way we build houses, which is throw them up cheap and then eat the ongoing costs with high heating and cooling costs.
Yeah.
But then also things like damp and mould. We saw something like 16% of the population of renters reporting damp and mould, which is, it's a significant share.
Yeah, that was certainly my experience as a renter, I have to say.
Yeah.
Lots of black mould problems.
Yeah. And then things like getting repairs done by your landlord. About 40% say that repairs are done fairly quickly. Interestingly, we asked landlords a lot of questions as well, and a lot of landlords say that they don't really prioritise fixing things in their rental properties. So it's very interesting. Like actually, renters report that their landlords repair things at a faster rate than landlords themselves report. So I guess it's partly about expectations.
I think one thing I really want to highlight with the work the Centre's doing, and it's evidenced through this initial piece of work, this survey, which is enormous, and if you go to housingmonitor.org.au, you can access all the data that we have up there and you can play around with it yourselves. We're not possessive of this stuff. We want to inform a public conversation, so do check it out.
In there. Find some stuff that we haven't found yet.
That's right. See what you can pull out of the data. We'd be delighted to have some new perspectives. But the important thing to emphasise is that we're not picking sides in a battle on this. The Centre wants to look at all of the issues, and the original report we did with VNF about 12 months ago, which was looking at housing affordability, we called it a wicked problem because it is. There's too much, I think, dispute in the debate between economists who think it's all a supply side issue, that we should just build more houses and everything's fine, and then those on the other side who say, well, no, it's a demand side issue, we've got too many investors and we should just reform taxes and that will be fine. We don't think any one of those things is a silver bullet, right? We think we need to look at the whole system of the market and ask, does this work as a market? Because in my view, it doesn't.
I think it's a really multi-layered and complex problem that often gets boiled down to relax planning regulations so that developers can fix the market. And we know that doesn't happen. People in property development don't build houses below a certain profit margin.
They're not into it for the goodness of their hearts. It's not an altruistic pursuit being a property developer, is it?
But we also know that it's not going to be solved by simply removing property investors either. This is something that will require. It's a big. If you want a metaphor, it's like a big tanker that we need to turn around.
Yeah.
It's going to take a long time to turn it around because we've allowed this slide over 30, 40 years of increasing mortgage access for investors. We've pumped a lot of more money into the property market because we've become a richer nation. We've condensed our population more and more into just 3 cities, and those cities are not well suited to expanding because we have one CBD in Melbourne, and that is a shocking state of affairs. We don't have regional cities like comparable countries would have, like in Britain. You've got Birmingham, you've got Manchester, we don't have those second-tier cities in Australia at the same sort of scale.
Don't call Manchester a second-tier city, my friend. You can tell Matt's from the south, folks.
It's no London, mate. Go on.
I'm standing up for my city of birth. But no, the point you make's real. I mean, it is a wicked and multifaceted problem, and you alluded at the start to wanting to cut through some of those tropes that dominate the debate, which I think is so important. There's too much, well, it's all those greedy boomers soaking up all the wealth, or landlords are trying to rip you off, and actually people that have bought investment properties have acted in rational self-interest based on the market we've created.
And not just the market, but the definite signals that we provide, which is please do buy
please
a second.
do.
Yeah, please
if you've got extra money, put it into property.
Yeah, don't put it in your super, don't put it elsewhere. We'll give you a better tax treatment in your investment property.
Yeah.
We'll let you write off your losses through negative gearing, and we'll give you a capital gains discount at the end of the day.
And so that's tied up, $10 trillion in our property market. 60% of bank profits are tied to residential real estate. The opportunity costs for the rest of the economy there are significant as well, aren't they?
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, if you think about just the increase over the pandemic years was over $300 billion increase in the value of Australia's 10 million homes, right?
Yeah.
That's bigger than the entire ASX,
Yep.
The market capitalisation of every firm in the ASX. And that was in 2 years of growth, which is just mind-boggling. And it's just a huge amount of money to be sloshing around in the economy, fairly unregulated, or in my opinion, not well enough regulated. And that leads to banks chasing that sort of return.
Yeah.
Because, like you say, 60% of banks' asset sheets are based on residential mortgages now.
And extremely inequitably distributed. At the same time as that was happening, our survey shows about 1.25 million Australians have seen an increase in housing stress over the same time. So there's a very unequal outcome there.
Yeah, I mean, we're rewarding the incumbents, and we're rewarding people who have access to capital. And that obviously doesn't really work with a nation that's based on an immigration system like ours, which is anyone can come, establish themselves, set up a new life. It really flies in the face of the Australian dream.
It really does. So what we're trying to do with the centre is, as I said, you want to really drive a bigger public conversation, put some evidence behind the facts that get into the public debate, and challenge some of those beliefs that are holding us back on political action.
That's a good question. Yeah, so I think what the plan really is to examine some of the major causes of housing system failure, the causes and effects, and the timescales and interactions. Because the housing market is unusual, like it works in this very long cycle, much longer than the business cycle. And we want to really identify some of the blockages to reform. As you said, there's a lot of vested interests. One thing that the survey identified was that many people with a single investment property, their views were much more aligned to people without any investment properties than they were to people with 2 or 3. Maybe we can call them like professional investors. Yeah. And the people that you hear about from the property councils, they're going to be representing mostly those more vocal, higher leveraged, many more property kind of type investors.
Yeah, like that guy on Brisbane Radio that had 384 investment properties, and we were meant to feel sorry for him.
Yeah, that's right. So like the narratives coming out of the investment councils and property investment councils will come from that extreme end, where you've got 10 or more investment properties. And what we think is that there's a whole bunch of people, which is the majority of investors, who have a single investment property, but we found that they were willing to see, or nearly a majority of them were willing to see a decline in their investment property to help housing affordability, and B, that they're more likely to vote for significant changes as well.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the more interesting findings, and something we'll dive more deeply into down the track, because intuitively, and this is where I come in with my very unscientific opinions, intuitively you'd think, well, those so-called mum and dad investors that have just sunk a bit of a windfall, maybe when they've had an inheritance later in life, or maybe when they've had a bonus at work and they've got into the property market with just a small investment property that they're renting out and hoping to supplement their retirement income. That's very different than someone that's very highly leveraged and has taken on a lot of debt for multiple investment properties, and therefore any changes to the tax arrangements or to the regulation or to APRA regulations will really affect them, because what we've done is create a market that supports their speculation and their highly leveraged debt to build a property portfolio.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily serving those small investors who are the majority of landlords too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this relates to the problems with rental tenure, as you know, as we've talked about before. Because so many of our landlords only have one or two properties, they're looking to realise a capital gain, they're unlikely to give longer term leases and more security of tenure.
Yeah, that's right. So there is some research from Longview, the company Longview, and they have really identified that, well, firstly, that you don't get a strong return on rental investment in Australia in terms of yields, the rental, like the amount of money you get from the rent each month, but you do get the return from the capital gains.
Yeah.
So a lot of people will be in the game of getting an investment property and maybe not making particularly any decent money off the rent, but they can offset losses through negative gearing, and then they realise their investment after 4, 5, 6, 10 years, whatever it might be, through capital gains.
And they're only taxed 50% of their marginal tax rate on those capital gains.
That's right.
That's right.
So, that's $12 million a year or so that we give out in capital gains tax discounting.
Billion.
Sorry, billion.
And on top of negative gearing,
on
top of negative gearing, you're starting to talk about serious money after a while.
20 billion maybe in a couple of years. So
right.
Enormous money. And so, we're really, as you say, we're designing this market to suit a specific type of people, but it doesn't help renters, because, if you're in the game of realising a capital investment after a few years, you don't necessarily want to have a long-term tenant. And this is one of the big differences between the US and Europe and Australia, which is that you have institutional investors or long-term housing investors in America and in Europe, and they're more concerned with farming the yield of rent, and they might get quite a low return, but it's a consistent return year in, year out. And so they're willing to have a tenant for 10 years. In fact, it suits them better to have a tenant for 10 years. It's less of a transaction cost of getting a new person in. And that means you're more likely to have a much more stable rental relationship. Yeah. Whereas in Australia, the average tenure is what, two years or so?
That's right, and it's declining all the time.
Yeah, in our survey, 15% of renters had moved within the last 6 months.
Yeah.
So it's a huge turnover, and it's not just an individual cost. That's got an enormous consequence for the overall economy. You've got this huge churn of people having to constantly move, trying to find somewhere still close to their work. They're taking days off work to move, all that kind of stuff. So it's not just you can sort of see it as a triple threat to society, which is the individual cost, the social cost of constantly being unsure of what's going to happen next and having to subsidise that, and then the economic cost as well.
And what the data clearly shows is that even though 85% of non-homeowners, and that includes people still living at home with their families, with their parents, for example, but primarily renters as well. While that 85% still want to buy a home, we found that 70% of renters would be happy to rent long term if they could treat their property as a home, if they could put up a picture, have a pet, change the carpet as they can do in some European countries.
Yeah.
So not only have we removed the ladder of opportunity, as they call it, for those people to buy a home, but we've created a rental market in which they can't form a secure home either. So we're giving them no options at all.
Yeah, and I think the sort of traditional way of viewing the Australian housing market was you live with your parents and then you rent for a few years while you save up for your deposit and then you buy a house. And probably that was true for everyone apart from the very poorest in society, the majority. Now that that's broken down, all the systems and laws and regulations that we had in place no longer fit. They're no longer fit for purpose, right? And as we've spoken before about how it was only in 2020 that Victoria legislated to have a flushing toilet in every rented property. It's real Victorian level stuff.
Pretty backwards.
I mean, Victorian is in the era rather than the state.
It's like other areas of social and economic policy, right? Like, as you just said, our whole ecosystem is based on the idea that people rent for a few years in their 20s and then they buy a house. It's a bit similar to the rate at which job seekers set, which is the assumption that you're going to be on unemployment benefits for a few months as a young person in a share house. until you get a job. Whereas we now know that the biggest group on job seeker are people over 45.
Yeah.
So we've got sort of laws and regulations that are set for the Menzies era.
Yeah.
And we're living in a time when those regulations have been left in place and the market has been encouraged to expand beyond the scope of those regulatory restrictions. And we've really created a mess for everyone that isn't in the top 10 or 20% of income earners.
Which I think is a really good point to pivot towards what people want to do, what we found in the survey about what people want to do in solving this situation. So I guess the first thing to point out is how high up the agenda this housing affordability is for voters. So we asked a range of issues through reducing crime, improving Medicare, building more public housing, cost of living, and so on. Housing affordability was scored the second or third highest, depending on the age group that we asked.
Yeah. So it was in the top 3 concerns across the population.
Across the board, yeah. It is very stratified across the age groups, with older people who tend to be own a house without a mortgage being less concerned, and young people just entering the rental market being most concerned. But yeah, across the board, it was the third issue out of 10 that we tested, and that's really, I think, indicates where we're heading towards in terms of maybe the next federal election being a housing affordability election.
And worth pointing out too that this survey was done in December. There's been 3 more rate rises since then, so we would expect those concerns to be even higher today, despite the fact we got a bit of a reprieve in the April RBA decision to hold rates at least for 1 month.
Well, yeah, but the other side of the coin is that we have a whole bunch of people on their fixed rate mortgages about to fall off the mortgage cliff, including myself. So in June, my rate will go from 2.3% to 6.
Yeah.
Who knows? But yeah, it's not going to be a comfortable
scary stuff.
Month.
See me about a pay rise, mate.
So yeah, clearly it's going to be an electoral issue. And what we found when we asked swing voters how important it was for them was that for swing voters it was enormously important. So as an example, for your typical Liberal voter, housing affordability was regarded as a key issue by 55% of the Liberal voter population. But for Liberal swing voters, it goes up to over 80%. Yeah, it's an enormous issue for them.
And as I said at the outset, we're seeing this now starting to play out at the ballot box. We're seeing finally politicians think, why aren't young people voting the way they used to? Could it be something to do with the fact that we've pulled the rug out from under them on the social mobility ladder, and housing is the biggest part of that, along with the insecure jobs that they have, and the two things are not divorced, as you showed in the research that you did recently. The divorce of wage growth from land prices has really taken off in the last 20 years.
Yeah, and it's a two-pronged story, right? You've got the house prices spiralling out of control, but you've also got wage stagnation, particularly for younger home builders, or whatever you want to call it, that younger demographic. You're so much less likely to be on a permanent contract. Yeah. You're not seeing your wages linked to CPI or any other sort of inflation measure, and you're just being stationary for 10 years maybe in that lower wage bracket.
There are so many problems with the housing market. We didn't turn up much good news at all in this survey, really. We've got to a situation where the laissez-faire approach to housing by successive governments in this country has created a situation in which only those at the very top of the market who own their own home or have investments, and more than one, really feel that they're benefiting from the housing market as it stands, and also a strong appetite in our survey for government intervention.
Really strong, and this is the good news of the survey. It's the
only bit of good news.
This is the really
There's
good
an
news.
appetite for change.
Yeah, a huge appetite for change. So we asked people a range of policy. Well, we suggested a whole bunch of policy options for them to consider, and public housing came out as far and away the most popular of all the options. So over 70% of the population want to see more public housing construction. And that's great, and it's great for a number of reasons. I'm a big fan of increasing public housing, not just for housing. Not just for housing people that need supported rental costs, but also because it in theory should cool off a whole bunch of the rental market as well. We know that people at the bottom end of the rental market tend to have the fewest options in terms of finding other kinds of accommodation. And that means that when, for example, Commonwealth rent assistance is increased, landlords at that bottom end of the market are able to scoop out a bigger share of that Commonwealth rent assistance.
That's right. It almost all goes at the bottom end straight into higher rental costs. And my own research over the years into the crisis of homelessness and risk of homelessness for older women shows that being in a private rental is the number one indicator for being in poverty in retirement.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
it's a huge issue.
Yeah.
What's next for the Centre for Equitable Housing? There's a lot of data here for us to mine, and I know you've got big plans to do more with it. But
yeah. Well, we have a fairly ambitious schedule of work over the next 12 months. We want to dig into this data a bit more and do some more complex analysis and use that to really tell some stories, I guess, as to what the problems are and what people want to do about them. We have a whole sort of train of research coming through on topics from the financialisation of housing, offering a sort of historical macro narrative perspective, through to much more targeted publications. For example, we're going to be doing, my colleagues Lucy Tonkin and Margaret McKenzie will be publishing a paper on gender and housing. That's one thing we haven't touched on yet.
Oh,
We've been holding up...
My passion too.
Yeah, we've been holding our powder dry on this particular issue because the survey brought up an incredible amount of gender disparity in housing affordability experience.
I think I was the only one not surprised by that.
Yeah. Well, I think it was surprising in how diverse and complex the disadvantage was for women in the housing market.
Yeah.
So we've got that paper coming out next month, but really we should be, we'll be pumping papers out from now until Christmas.
We
that's
will,
for sure.
and beyond, and lots of public engagement. We'll be hosting events and roundtables, and obviously, as you'd expect of a think tank, coming up with some policy ideas that we hope all levels of government might start to grapple with.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah. Well, look, that's all we've got time for today, but thanks so much, Matt, for coming on and chatting. Thank you for the amazing work you've done at the Centre for Equitable Housing, and thank you to our listeners for joining in. If you are interested in reading the Centre for Equitable Housing survey, the Housing Monitor, head over to Per Capita's website, which is percapita.org.au, or the Australian Housing Monitor is at housingmonitor.org.au, and as I said, all that data is freely available to be fiddled around with. Please join us next time when we continue to examine inequality and work towards a fairer Australia here at Per Capita for the next episode of Recap. This show is a production of Per Capita, the independent progressive think tank dedicated to fighting inequality in Australia. And we're committed to providing ad-free and editorially independent content too. We'd like to acknowledge that this podcast was recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, whose lands were never ceded, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present.